quickly recovered health. Dan had some work on language, and then he was doing so well in school that he was no longer eligible for the special services. But his mother and father got concerned about him when it was about 11th grade and he was beginning to think about college and where would he go and what could he do. And so they asked if we would look again. And in 11th grade, his spelling looks like this. He quickly recovered his health. A woman built, and he wrote B-I-L-T and tucked the U in later. Family, chicken, merchant, different, ought. He knew there ought to be an A and a U and an O and a U or something, and he was going to put whatever he could to make sure he could get as close as possible. If you look at his reading, his actual decoding level, his actual ability to read words was at that time at about a 6th grade level as an 11th grader. And he was still confusing in reading words like one and once, and busyness and business, and couldn't read scarcely, hung for had, spared for reared, two for this, short for sort, could not read the word industrious. Beyond for behind, event for evident, couldn't do character, procession for possession, define for dignifying, exlanting for exalting, stirring for securing. Those kinds of errors were still occurring for him. This young man was a college freshman and on an IQ test was above average. And in the silent reading, his score came out grade 13.5. So if nobody was listening to him, he could read and figure out the words to about the freshman college level. Many of those students say to me, if I can figure out about half the words, I can usually figure out what it's about. But that takes a tremendous amount of effort, tremendous amount of willpower and stick-to-itiveness. I asked Steve to write a paragraph, and this was his paragraph with spelling skills at about early 4th grade level. On Saturday night, on Channel 11, there is a science fiction documentary show. That has, so he's still having trouble with sentences, has the speaker talk about the movie that's being shown. And then they show the movie. Then at the end, they have more commentary. If you look at show or shown, he's spelled it 3 different ways. And if I ask him to tell me which one is correct, and none of them were, he would not be able to tell which one was even close. Senior at physical therapy school at the University of Minnesota. And in reading, her skills come out at about 7th grade level. Now she's going to complete her physical therapy program, but she was increasingly frustrated. Her younger brother, who was more dyslexic than Becky, was recognized very early because he started failing in about 3rd grade. And she managed to survive and could get through. But the kinds of errors in her reading, continuous for contagious, and she's studying the medical field, abroad for aboard, a clove for alcove. You'd think she and Mark had gone to school together. Run seed for rancid, munipicil for municipal, device for decisive, contemptuous for contemptuous, stagatum, protudens, particular for peculiarity. And then all of the other high-level language she just could not decipher. Let me see. Um, relevant statistics. Um, there is a brain anatomy study going on at Harvard, as I mentioned. They are actually asking known dyslexics to will their brains. And when the known dyslexic dies, they have gathered medical history, family history, educational history, and some kind of documentation from a recognized authority in the field with a diagnosis of dyslexia. They are able to solidify the brain and slice it into very thin slices and put it on slides, and they're looking at every 20th slide. They've looked at 14 brains and have found what they feel is a neurological variation that accounts for the unusual difficulty in processing language in the left hemisphere, where most of us process language. The genetics, they're doing, Bruce Pennington is involved in a Colorado family study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the March of Dimes, the National Orton Dyslexia Society. And they feel strongly that their current evidence supports the view that dyslexia is familial. We've been evaluating students for 50 years at our reading center, and you very seldom find somebody with the symptoms of dyslexia that does not have somebody else in the family, some earlier member of the family that has similar kinds of problems. We also feel strongly that if you can document it on both sides of the family, that you're apt to have more children in the next generation, and the degree of disability is apt to be stronger. It is the neurophysiological process that's inheritable, or the difficulty is inheritable, and they're not sure yet of what that inheritable possibility is, and I'm not a geneticist, so I can't help you with those statistics. There is a worldwide occurrence of this problem. The World Federation of Neurology was aware of that back in 1968, and there is documentation of this in every country where people learn to read and spell. It is worldwide, where human beings exist. MacDonald Critchley, who was the neurologist in England, said about 10 to 15% of the population, that's 10 to 15% of the blind, the deaf, and those with freckles, was the way he put it. It is a worldwide problem. The general agreement that 10 to 15% of the population struggles with it. It used to be that they considered the males more prone to this kind of problem. If you looked at remedial reading classes or learning disabilities classes across the country, the majority of the students were boys. The family study in Colorado is indicating that that's not so, that the girls are just as prone to this kind of problem as the boys. They're just not referred for special services nearly as quickly. The prison statistics, and I happen to know those because I spend one morning a week at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is in Rochester, the Federal Medical Center. And the statistics are that about 80 or 85% of the population in the federal prisons read below a 6th grade level. It's a very, very predominant problem. The college population has a special, the students with this kind of problem at college have some special added burdens, and I would like to just touch on those very quickly. For one thing, students who are intelligent enough and motivated enough to get to college have usually gone unrecognized. Usually, not always. So that they have some more subtle problems, and they are usually bright, have to be to compensate, willing to work harder than their friends or their peers to make up for the difference in the interference with the language. So that they've had the added burden of not being able to read and spell securely. But when they are underachieving, they are also accused of not studying And in many instances, that's not so. They often spend longer studying and are not able to achieve and produce or let people know in a written, on a test situation, just what they have been able to learn. They have a history of survival, but also a history of underachievement. Their inadequate skills are exacerbated at the college because of the amount of reading and the amount of spelling that's required. And many of them are not prepared for the added demands of college level work. So they may survive at the high school level with charm and wit and hard work. It just does not hold up for them when they get to the college level. Much more reading, much more writing. I see the students at Carleton because they fail the foreign languages. And for many of those students, they have learned to compensate and function extremely well because they've acquired a tremendous amount of language and understanding of language so that when people talk, they can understand the concepts and then deal with the concepts in their own language. But when the foreign language, if it's foreign language is required, it becomes a much greater handicap than learning to read and write in English was. The student is often accused of being lazy, not studying, disinterested, unmotivated, and time restrictions become an unusual burden for many of these students. I used Mark as an example because for him, the time burden to be done in a certain period of time then does not allow him to use what he has been able to use to compensate effectively. I know a lawyer who is a lawyer, very bright, very competent lawyer, but the only reason he was allowed to be a lawyer when he finished his classwork was that they allowed him unlimited time on the bar exam. I know a perfectly wonderful nurse who almost missed being a nurse by 20 minutes. It took her 20 more minutes than anybody else to finish the nurse's licensure test. And if they had not allowed her the extra time, she would not have been able to nurse. She was discovered, the reason for her reading and spelling problems discovered when she was a senior in nursing school. And she didn't have time to learn language, so she could improve her language quickly enough to pass the licensure test. What she needed was the extra time. A number of research findings are beginning to indicate more and more what's happening to the children and to the adults that have learning problems or different learning styles. Students who get into college programs are really not learning disabled. But they must be labeled that or called that in order to obtain the special considerations allowed by law that are necessary for them to survive. Melvin Levine, who's a very bright and well-known national pediatrician, calls them learning disorders. When I talk to college students, I like to point out that they have a different learning style. And when people begin to feel comfortable with learning styles and styles that are different, then education will provide educational procedures, instructional procedures that will allow for the differences. Some of you I know are in education classes, and I wasn't going to get into the instructional procedures unless you raised those questions. But psychology books say children learn differently at different rates. But if you go across the country and look at what's going on in classrooms today, in most classrooms, reading instruction is taught one way. If it happens to fit the way you learn, then things go along pretty well. If it doesn't happen to fit the way you learn, then you may be in serious trouble. If you look at math classes, math instruction is usually provided in one way. If it fits the way you process math information, then you'll probably do pretty well. If it doesn't happen to fit the way you process information, then you may be in serious trouble. It isn't that you can't learn math, it's that you can't learn it in the way that it's being presented in the classroom. Many teachers have not been taught to be aware of the signs. I've tested children. If you look at Daniel's spelling, it's very obvious, if you know what you're looking for, what his problem is. And yet his classroom teachers were not taught to recognize that or think of that as an indication of a problem, and never considered him as having a dyslexia or a language learning problem, or recognized it as anything of that sort. Many teachers teach according to what the teacher manual says or what they've learned at the college classes, and are very comfortable with teaching the way they learn, their style. And many teachers need to be taught to think about how others learn so that they can alter their teaching approach. Once the teachers are comfortable about doing this, then administrators have to allow them to do it, and also the materials have to be provided to go along with the teaching philosophy, and that's not occurring generally across this country either. A young student with a reading and spelling problem and not provided with appropriate help will grow up to be an adult who's going to have trouble in college classes and on the job. They are not going to be able to deal with the written language requirements of jobs. Most students with this kind of problem do not know what's happening, so they have the extra burden of that. So they're not able to tell a professor, I learn it better if I do it this way. I can do this if you give me extra time. The students are not in a position to advocate for themselves because they often don't understand what's been happening. So that many times when students can do that sort of thing, then professors, educators are much more willing to listen and try and in essence become more sensitive to what these individuals need. There's much that can be done educationally for these students. The teaching philosophy that's provided, the instructional philosophy that's provided, can make a tremendous difference. There really is no one that needs to go through school being considered word blind anymore. We really know enough about education to know what to do for these individuals and how it can work for them. For college students who suddenly find out what the problem is, they don't have time to work on language. They're off to college, and you all know what a frantic schedule that can be. So you don't have time to learn language at that point. So the accommodations are extremely important. Along the accommodations, very quickly, some of the routine kinds of things that people should be thinking about and asking for are extra time on tests. Just having the extra time to read and reread will help, even if you can't read all the words adequately. Permission to take lectures is very important, because the people with auditory problems who can't take notes have to sit and try and listen to the information being offered in a classroom, and notes would be tremendously important for them, but they can't take notes and listen and record language at the same time. So carbon copies of notes or taping lectures is extremely important. Seating preference is important. People who have difficulty with learning would like to hide in the back. Where they ought to be is right down in front, where they can watch and listen and observe the teacher's face. Registration preference. The young man that I referred to, Mark, there is a professor that teaches algebra in a very helpful way, but Mark's not eligible for that professor for some sort of logistic reason, so that he has to take algebra from a professor who moves too quickly, talks too fast, and doesn't offer enough support for his theories to help a student who's going to have difficulty with algebra. Reading lists ahead of time, very helpful. You can read during the summer, get your English literature read during the summer, so you'll have time to do something else at another during the school year. Not called on in class to read aloud. I've had students who've said, I've asked the teacher, please not to call on me, because if I have to stand up and read something, I just can't do it under that kind of pressure, and they get called on anyway. It would be very helpful for those individuals not to have to read out loud. Lapboard computers for the dysgraphic. Referral to special services. For example, at Carleton, the foreign language professors and the professors on campus who have dyslexic children are the ones who are very sensitive to this kind of problem and refer students on for other kinds of consideration. But the foreign language professors are the most sensitive because they see it, and they've gotten so that the student who fails the first period through a foreign language study is referred on for some kind of consideration, because if they can't deal with the foreign language with their other kinds of academic achievements, something must be amiss. And one last quote from a woman who works in Florida in a special program for dyslexic children. Nothing in history has had so much written, so many words written about the problem, and yet the individuals with this problem are as handicapped by the ignorance surrounding the handicap as they are by the handicap itself. Their own ignorance in not understanding, their parents' ignorance in not understanding, the teacher's lack of awareness or lack of knowing what to do, recognizing the problems. And this goes right on through college and right on through the job situations. Understanding helps, even if there isn't time to do anything else. Just the understanding of the problem, the student's understanding, the parents' understanding of what's happening, and the teacher's understanding. Kindergarten on through, graduate school. Very important, because many of these students then can go on and achieve astounding things, even if the language, the reading and spelling skills have not been adequately remediated. Okay, time for questions. I'm sure I've said things people don't agree with, or things that you'd like clarified. Yes.
What are some of the characteristics or some of the age groups maybe that we'll be able to tell the difference between a learning disability and a difference in learning style? What are some of the things we should look for?
Well, I think a learning disability is a difference in learning style. Oh, what are the age groups that you could recognize a learning disability or a difference in learning style? Starting in kindergarten.
Yeah.
First grade.
Characteristically, what do you look for?
In kindergarten, it's the spoken language, the sound discrimination. The people who are looking at this very carefully feel that the underlying problem is phonological awareness. The inability to take language and separate it, to take a word such as bat and separate it into its separate sounds, or the ability to take sounds that are separated and blend them together orally, not even written, but orally. One of the very precursors that you find in these children. The children that are late to talk. Those with dyslexia, the difficulty with writing, you can see it in first grade. I know that many of the schools postpone any kind of program for help till third grade, thinking that most of it is maturation. But if you can find the children in kindergarten and first grade and provide the instructional procedures that are effective, then it doesn't matter whether it's maturation or a true language disability. The instructional intervention helps for both. Some of those children that are less handicapped you'll begin to find it along about 4th or 5th grade. And the ones who can read but have trouble with auditory processing and ultimately have trouble with comprehension, You'll find that when they get, so they have to do reading and give back information, so the comprehension breaks down. It doesn't stay up with the other kinds of things you'd expect a child to do. So you see, if you can have both visual and auditory processing problems, memory problems. It depends upon what you have, which one you have, or if you have both, and what degree you have. The children that are recognized usually early are the ones that have severe problems in both visual and auditory memory, processing of language. And the ones that have strength in one area and not the other usually get a little farther along before they're picked up. But you see, when educators begin to look at learning styles and the fact that children learn differently at different rates and in different ways, we really wouldn't need a term learning disability. We wouldn't need it. We would provide for that difference educationally. It's a long time coming. Yes.
Is there a book or something written or a program which would teach learning strategies and coping skills to help these students as they learn somewhere along the way that they have a difference in process?
For the children to learn? One book, and Melvin Levine is the author. He's a pediatrician, and it's put out by Educators Publishing Service in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's called Keeping Ahead in School. And it's ahead, keeping ahead in school. And it's written, it's written for the adolescent, but it's something that parents would benefit from reading and then could interpret it to a younger child.
How about college students? Basically.
Well, I'd still recommend this for a college student. And he talks about the different learning disorders that are available and what students need to do in order to survive. It's a little, some bright college students might be a little insulted by the level of it, but it's very clear and very extensive, covers all of the learning problems that I've talked about tonight and a few more. I would recommend it. In terms of learning disorder, I really think it's probably the most helpful one I've read. Yes?
How about having tests read to them and they can answer orally?
Yes, certainly. Some of the students with the dyslexia, whatever you call it, dyslexia, developmental reading disability, or whatever, are eligible for TAPE textbooks, but also services for the blind. So for schools that don't provide taped textbooks, those students are eligible for services for the blind. And the services for the blind provide, if you send the textbooks in far enough ahead of time, will tape anything the student needs. I know.
It takes 6 months to get the text tape. It takes
About 3 months.
6 weeks to get
Six
it
weeks,
on
it
order.
takes 6 weeks and you need to send it to
But
textbook.
if you have a new one, David, it takes 6 months.
Mhm.
Believe me.
You've
I've
tried,
had-
huh?
I've
Yeah.
had students that had 3 texts that didn't arrive for
Mm.
the same semester.
Oh, frustrating.
Very frustrating
Mhm.
for them.
Try the retirement home in town. We finally did that for one Bible college student, and the retirees in the retirement home just took turns reading chapters so the student could get it in time for class.
That'd be a good-
Yes.
Some of the examples you showed of the chronic misspelling,
Yes.
are there effective instructional strategies for those people? And if not, what are some adaptions that you could do?
Are you a student in education?
Yes,
Do you have 3 minutes?
I do.
Okay, let me show you. If you look at state of the arts right now, there are 4 primary ways that we all know to teach reading. And I've just added out here, and it's so recent that I put it in handwriting, is called whole language. And the whole language philosophy is that children learn to talk by listening to people talk. And therefore, children can learn to read by listening to people read. And that's a super simple description of what's happening. But the children are taught to read by going to the library and picking out a book and trying to figure out as many words in the book as they can figure out, or by sitting on father's lap and being read to. The whole word approach, and if you have gray hair like as I do, you learn to read with Dick and Jane and Sally. Any of you remember learning Dick and Jane and Sally? Okay, that was a whole word approach. It was originally developed by Gaudet, who was interested in educating the deaf. And he studied young children's language over a period of time and wrote stories involving the common everyday language that occurred in children's everyday kinds of speech. And then he wrote stories, thus Dick, Jane, Sally, run, come, look, mother, father, policeman, umbrella, etc. Interesting is somebody got a hold of that idea and thought it was a wonderful way to teach reading and introduced it into the public education reading. Gaudet decided that it didn't work for deaf children and dropped it. But it stayed on and on and on. Under the whole word, there are two subcategories. One is that the teachers were not allowed to teach phonics. Children didn't need phonics. So phonics was not taught. And in those programs, the whole word programs that allowed phonics, it was all part of the word. You never taught phonics in isolation. It was C is the sound that comes at the beginning of come, cat, coat. T is the sound that comes at the beginning of toe, tent, toast, never in isolation. And you move across the continuum, the linguistic programs believed that you could teach words in families so that you could teach the Ann family, and then you put an M in front of it and it's man, fan, ran. And the pure linguistic ones would not teach anything in isolation, but the words were introduced as word families, sound families, phonetically organized sound families, the and family, the ast family, the end family, the it family, etc. And in some of those linguistic programs, the teachers were allowed to teach the consonants in isolation, never the vowels, only the consonants in isolation. So you could teach that T said t, M says F says f, but you couldn't teach the fact that A says a, E says eh, etc. And then there is a philosophy that's called structured phonics, and the philosophy is that you teach the children all the sound-symbol relationships, all of them, one at a time, in isolation. And then you teach the child how to put that together. So that if they look at a word and they recognize it, they read it. If they look at a word and they don't recognize it, they know the pieces, so they know how to put the pieces together. And then you teach it for spelling. If you look at spelling programs, the spelling programs also range through that same way. The whole language spelling program, in third grade, the spelling list is dinosaur, combination, illustration, I've even forgotten. But I had a third grader in a whole language, and he was reading at a second grade level. That was a spelling list. He still couldn't spell phonetic words regularly, and those words were just impossible for him. But that was the spelling list for the day.
So phonics,
Pardon?
so are you saying phonics is the best?
Oh, for the child, if you accept the fact that a child can't see language inside the head, so they don't have a filing system that provides them with the visual imagery for the words, then they have to know the parts. And they have to be able to put the parts together. They have to be able to hear language and separate it. So that a child, for example, if you can see splash inside your head, then you write splash. If you can't see splash, then you have to be able to take the word splash and separate it into its separate sounds, and then know what to do with s, p, o, a, sh. And at the college level, if you can't see professor inside your head, you have to know how words are made up, and then know that if you say pro, you write pro, P-R-O. That's the syllable, open syllable pro. The root word is fess, and you have to double the S to keep the vowel short. And you have several choices at the end, but if it sounds like a harder level word from Latin, then your best guess is OR. So you can intellectually analyze professor and spell it correctly, even if you can't see it. If you have strong language and can see language, then you don't need that kind of information. If you have trouble with seeing language, you need somebody to start with the single sounds and then deal with syllables and move on into the higher levels of language. To teach intellectually, you have to move on up to the intellectual level how the English language works. I'm not sure I can. You know the diagram with the boy? You have to move up language up to how the English language works instead of leaving it at the memory level. And that it takes careful, structured, sequential teaching. The schools that are doing that in classrooms that start and find the children in first grade and work through very carefully in the classroom every day are demonstrating that it's very effective and makes a statistically significant difference in what the children are able to do. Yes. Oh. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did, thank you.
So is this something that if they learn this in the first, second, third, early elementary, that by the time they reach the university level, they'll be able to have the skills to go on as the rest of us see things? Or
They'll never. What happens is that that if you build for them this master puzzle called How the English Language Works, and you put one piece at a time in, and I could give you a test to see how well you all understand English, and you would be amazed at what you can do and what you don't know about why you do it. There are 5 ways to spell the sound of k in the English language, and there are rules that govern a lot of that. So that if you understand and know that, that is extremely helpful. If you don't need it, then you do it without knowing that. If you need it, you need to understand how that works. The students that are very dyslexic, that have lots and lots of difficulty with visual memory, need to be taught all the way through. They don't have the language ability to be shown at the first and second grade the sort of the patterns for the easy words. They can't go on and finish the language for themselves. They really need someone to carry it all the way through high-level language so they can go on and do whatever they need to do, high school, college, graduate work. And others just simply need to figure out that there is a system to the language and have a little bit of difficulty and enough language energy to finish figuring out the system for themselves. Quick example, saw an 11th grader, worked with him in 11th, reading at about a second grade level, worked with him 3 times a week, 11th grade, summer, 12th grade, summer. Then he went into the Navy. And 4 years later he came back and he said, I'd like you to work with me some more. I'd really like to be able to read better. And he said, I remember everything you taught me. And I tested him, wanting to know, I gave him reading, spelling, listened to it all, to find out what he had been able to do. And he remembered everything he'd learned till the day he went into the Navy, but he was not able, he wasn't language able enough to go on and do more for himself because he was so dyslexic that it just didn't, he couldn't figure out the pattern and needed somebody to teach it to him piece by piece by piece. So some, if you can get them early and show them that there's a pattern, sometimes that's all they need. And others need them need to be taught all the way through. And even with the man with the Campbell soup cans, to get him to reading, even if you could do it every day in the classroom regularly, and in high school English, to get him reading at about a 7th or 8th grade level is about all you could expect. Spelling at about a 5th or 6th grade level is probably the most he would be able to do, even with consistent instruction all along the way.
How do I know? I have an 8-year-old son who is in learning disabilities right now, fits into this category perfectly, very highly IQ tested, but cannot read. How do I know that he's being taken care of with this half hour a day in learning disabilities? As a mother, I want him to be able to go on, but how do I know that they're taking care of him in this reading program?
Well, a couple of things. If you read and have more information about what kind of instruction he needs, and then go observe
I
and
know
watch.
how she's teaching him, but
Mhm.
I don't know if that's how he can learn.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, if he,
What books would you recommend?
Read with him. Read
Oh, I
with
do.
him.
I
Okay,
know.
then I would recommend that so that you know yourself where he's at.
I know where he's at, but I don't.
in trouble. Uh-huh.
Is he in trouble?
Uh-huh.
But I don't know if, yeah, I don't know
I-
if the
yeah.
teacher is helping. She's teaching him man, can,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
3-letter words at this
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
Is that what he needs to learn?
I think the other thing that you would want to watch is that for those children that are in serious trouble, it isn't just the visual input of language. You want them to be writing also. If I saw your son and I wanted to know if the teacher was doing everything possible, one of the questions I would ask him is, do you do any writing during your reading class? And if he said no, I would feel concerned. Because if the teacher doesn't have a child write and trace and feel letters and in the mouth but also in the hand, then she's missing or he is missing one pathway of learning. And for some of those with both visual and auditory dyslexia, the only pathway is the kinesthetic. You only learn the difference between B and D by the way it feels, not by the way it looks, because they can't tell by looking. So it's lots and lots of tracing and feeling.
He was absolutely
That's some-
thrilled when he came home and he said, "This is a B,
Uh-huh.
and this is a D."
Yeah.
You know,
Now, when that
so now I
translates
can-
into writing on a paper, then you'll know
Yeah,
it.
he can lay it down and
Uh-huh.
say, "This is a B."
Mhm.
So he can just remember. what
Just,
it is.
yeah, step one.
But, yeah.
Mhm. Yes.
You talked about foreign languages. Is it possible for someone with dyslexia to learn a foreign language? Maybe not master it, but, get some keywords, be happily conversational? Is that possible?
It is. You have to look at the degree of difficulty with language, and if it's visual and auditory. Most of the students whom I see get through high school foreign languages okay, but I've decided after testing college students from all over the country that high school foreign language classes are not very demanding, so they can survive. Get a B, get a C, occasionally get an A, but they always have to work harder than any of their other classes at the high school level. And what happens at the college level, it's the pace, the rate at which they have to master the language that becomes extremely difficult. So if you wanted to go to travel in France and wanted some conversational French, wait until you're all done with your credits, get your degree, and then go learn conversational French enough to go to visit the country.
But how do you learn, do you learn it by listening to tapes or studying
Talking.
out of your own book?
Whole
Oh.
language again.
Or-
Right? I mean,
Whole language.
that's the new approach to teaching languages anyways, the whole language approach, just like you said,
Yeah.
as far as reading. I think that it came out of that body of literature that has to do with second language acquisition and the natural approach to learning a language. I mean, we don't teach our children grammar drills and audiolinguistic sort of things in the home, we do it by talking with them, interacting with them.
But that's still difficult with a foreign language because I don't know. I'd love to learn German, but I don't know anybody who speaks German. It's really hard for me. hear the words to see if I'm saying them right.
Mm.
I mean, it's.
Take a term in
yeah,
Germany.
I was wondering if,
Yeah.
if tapes do help.
It strictly depends on the way people process
That's all I
language,
was
whether that's
curious
going to be a
about.
helpful way or not.
Mhm.
David?
I took Latin in high school, and as far as Latin went, and with my learning disability, it was there. I learned a lot more than a lot of people did in the class, because a lot of the words that I learned were very concrete. I mean, still to this day, I can look at that Latin and I can remember what those words mean. But as far as going and writing those out and having the correct spelling in that, that's where the problem comes in. A lot of the times it's with the spelling. And like I also took French in high school, and the problem then came again with the spelling. It's a lot of the spelling and that type of stuff. Or like in Latin, it's you change around word arrangements and that type of stuff. And in French, it's doing a little bit of that, but it's that as well as like speaking, because the person I had for French was a native of France, and it was just, it was no problem with her speaking the language. It was a matter of being able to go and bring it back is the big problem that I had with my learning.
Spelling is always the most difficult. If my life depended on it, I could only give one test. I'd give a spelling dictation. I wouldn't even allow a student creative writing, because bright students can make marvelous paragraphs and marvelous writing and spell every word correctly, but they become very creative at being able to say what they want to say in the words they can spell. So if you want to really know whether a student's having difficulty, you give it spelling dictation and outline for them what words you want them to write, and you can see the confusions more obviously there than, because spelling, the pulling it back, as David said, is always the most difficult. Yes?
What do you do if you're already through college and you're going into the profession and you have a very hard time spelling? How do you go back words to be able to learn it so that, or have some
Mhm.
type of test to maybe show your employer that you do have a problem to get around by doing other things?
Just, it's never too late to learn, to improve your spelling, especially if you've been able to get through college. To find whichever community you end up working in, to see if there's somebody in that community who has some background experience in working with high-level students. If you don't find someone, write me at the Reading Center. I'd be glad to outline a couple of things. What you do with college